we acquired a three-dimensional map of the island that we generated into a model, and then we added accurate simulated wave behavior so that we were able to produce an interactive exhibit that allows the lawyers and the witnesses to move objects all in real time.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 88. Ever wondered how drones can be used in the legal profession? If you ask today's guest, he'd tell you that drones are helping juries better understand the facts in complicated accident cases. Mark Johnson is the co-founder and chief creative officer of Visual Law Group, a company in San Jose, California that provides a variety of litigation support services. The company is comprised of creative visual media professionals who, by utilizing the most cutting-edge software and technology, create innovative and easy-to-understand stories and presentations. In 2015, Mark began using drones to collect aerial data, create 3D models, and produce virtual reality scenes to support cases of litigation. In this episode, Mark talks about the field of visual law, the rise of drones in the profession, and the opportunities that drone technology offers in the litigation process. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Mark to introduce himself.
I'm Mark Johnson, and I'm a co-owner and founding partner of a company called Visual Law here in San Jose, and our business is forensic visualization, where we actually typically work for anyone that is involved in civil or criminal litigation that needs to either analyze or tell a story. And it isn't just limited to the courtroom. It can be in civil hearings, mediation, and committee proceedings.
What's the driving force behind visual law?
As the society has become more and more visual, that all areas, forensic or crime or litigation related, are now hinging upon visual techniques of telling stories and analyzing information. And so that's what our company does.
Is the field of visual law considered an actual practice of law?
It's not a practice of law. You know, I formerly practiced law in the Midwest, but this company is what we would call a forensic services organization. It'd be similar to surveyors or consultants. Our clients are often lawyers or legal-related entities, but we are strictly a high-end consulting or service organization who deals primarily in visual information.
How did this evolve into a service?
Well, it's kind of interesting. When I was a trial lawyer, we were specializing in large catastrophic injury cases, explosions, airline crashes, and the like. And this was back in the 80s, and we ended up more and more relying upon the developing technologies of video, film, and some early computer animation. And as I got involved and started using the technology in the legal field, I realized that this is really an opportunity that was of more interest to me than the practice of law per se. And so I moved out to California at the end of 1992 and kind of built from scratch the first company that I called Second Chair Litigation Support. And back then, what we were really pushing was the use of computer animation in the courtroom. And my background was not that of a computer animator or a graphic artist, but I was extremely interested in it, and so I was largely self-taught. And back then, we didn't have college programs developed for teaching people to be 3D animators or to be visual effects artists. It was all a developing field. But we kind of rode that horse, and I was somewhat instrumental in developing some of the visual techniques that now are much more common in the courtroom. And as time went on, we became very, very big users and proponents of aerial imagery, which back then in the 90s had to be purchased from aerial service companies, primarily fixed wing, and very low quality, really. As we then move forward in time, and as aerial imagery became more common and more commercially available, we began to see the development of large databases. And I remember vividly when the first multi-CD collections of aerial imagery became available, and it was just life-changing. And now I look back and I see what we can get from Google Earth, Google Maps, Bing, all of the aerial service and the geospatial companies, vendors, and online programs. It's amazing how this field has developed. And of course, in the middle of all this, the drone and the ability to get your own high-resolution aerial imagery was a match made in heaven for any company like ours. My initial drones were based on the German microcopter flight controller, and I was partial to the New Zealand airframes of the DroidWorks heavy lifting drones, and we would fly little Sony cameras on belt-driven gimbals that all look really primitive now. But it was absolutely a revolution in terms of the technology, and that started us on the path of becoming specialists in acquiring our own aerial imagery that then developed and morphed into where we are today, which is using extensively three-dimensional photogrammetric models and high-resolution orthographic imagery that are all based on source data from drones.
The tools that you use are new, but the concept of visual forensics has been around for a while. Isn't it similar to the idea of taking the jury to the scene of the crime and reenacting the events that occurred?
That's a good observation. And if we want to talk about the concept of visual forensics, which I think is a fair term, you really go back to some of the pioneers, which were, heavily based on the West Coast, such as the great trial lawyer Melvin Belli was acknowledged early pioneers of visually bringing information into the courtroom. And as the need to provide more visual information just mounted, we started seeing things. For instance, there was a couple guys that had these telescoping poles that they would use to get imagery of crime scenes or crash sites. And that then evolved. There were a couple guys that were experimenting with tethered balloons. And we were playing with some of that ourselves. Back in the early and mid-'90s, we did an awful lot of railroad litigation involving disasters at railroad crossings. And those cases required aerial imagery, and in many instances, it was not easy to get from any commercial sources. So we began using remote-controlled helicopters with the traditional single blade before the multi-rotor revolution caught on. And back then, stabilization was not even possible, so we were flying, a Nikon camera shooting static images, even though we did some stuff to try to stabilize the video imagery. Back then, we didn't really have good digital video cameras. We had the old original Sony RX100 or whatever the hell it was, and it was not suitable either as a payload to lift, and certainly had limitations in terms of that old digital video format. But as you say, the concept was there, and necessity is always the mother of invention. And so these things really became inevitable. Every time that we made an improvement in the ability to get images from above, and sometimes we'd hire a full-size helicopter, which was extraordinarily expensive. We also, on occasion, would hire a small plane, and there were, back then, some aerial operators that had some camera setups that they operated from beneath a Cessna that were prohibitively expensive. And so we would typically get somebody hanging out the door at a fast shutter speed trying to capture a series of images along a highway. And all of that just presaged and actually foreshadowed what we have now, because the need was there, but the ability to get a camera in the air inexpensively was the holy grail that until very recently was just not solvable.
Maybe you can walk us through a recent case to show us how drone technology was used.
I think that's a good way to approach it. Several come to mind, but a couple cases that are really illustrative of this, I can think of two of them. The first one recently handled a case involving a terrible mishap that occurred at the Hawaiian volcanic atoll called Molokini, right off of the Maui coast. Very popular snorkeling diving location, and on this particular occasion, a a group went out, but unfortunately the remnants of a tropical storm were bearing down on the island and caught the group unawares, and several injuries and a terrible death occurred. The case required really demonstrating a lot of elements based on where the boat was and where divers were in relation to the bottom, and particularly where events took place as the surf was breaking on the volcanic crater shoreline. And I was surprised. We were working with the University of Hawaii Oceanography Department, and it turns out there was just extremely little, almost no, really good data for the actual contours of the bathymetry, the subsurface terrain of the lagoon. And there also was very little, certainly we couldn't find it, a really good information, survey-based or topography of the crater. The best I could find was an 1883 book that was in the Historical Library in Hawaii, where a survey crew camped out on the island for 4 days and actually surveyed it. And that survey actually was rather useful, but it certainly was dated. So here we were, we needed this information, and it was obvious to me that this was a perfect instance where there was really no way to get what we needed except with a drone. So I rented a boat, got up before dawn, and at 6 a.m. I was out at Molokini Crater, had a good friend at the helm while I flew a little Phantom 3 from the back of the boat, and we acquired a three-dimensional map of the island that we generated into a model, and then we added accurate simulated wave behavior based on the testimony of the oceanographers, so that we were able to replicate the events visually and also produce an interactive exhibit that allows the lawyers and the witnesses to move objects and note where things are, all in real time in the courtroom. And so it's a great example of how this technology allowed us to produce an exhibit that is really unprecedented in terms of, you would have had to use traditional aerial photographs, and then to get actual survey information without the advent of drone-based photogrammetry, it would be daunting and certainly cost prohibitive. And it's also protected federal preserve, so you really couldn't do it legally anyway to get a total station out on the rocks.
For the modeling aspect, are you using something that you developed in-house or a commercial application?
I'm an extreme evangelist and supporter of the software package called Pix4D that's created by a company out of Switzerland that I consider personally to be the leader, the top of the food chain in terms of photogrammetric reconstruction. It processes locally on our own machines, which is something important to me. It's not a cloud-based processing solution. And it generates a number of outputs, including point clouds, three-dimensional meshes, orthographic images, contour, topographic maps, and digital elevation models. So it's a really sophisticated package, and one that I, without hesitation, recommend to anybody that's in the geospatial or forensics field.
Okay, just so that I understand it, you're using drones to compile data and build 3D models so that during the trial, the attorneys can interact with the model to get their points across.
That is correct. And the other interesting thing is there's another couple software package we use that allow us to bring that data into virtual reality viewers such as the Oculus or the Vive VR viewer. And you can actually then get a 360 interactive view of the scene using VR goggles, which is really pretty astounding.
Does that give people the perspective of actually being in the crater and looking around?
Yes, it does. And it's we are actually developing and are working right now with a retired judge, and the good people at Stanford Law School have kindly agreed to allow us to use their facility to do some tests to have an actual seated jury wearing the Oculus headset so that they can have a virtual view of the scene. And, you mentioned earlier about the concept of taking a jury to the scene of a crime or the scene of an accident. That's a long-held and yet expensive tool that is often not practical or not allowed by judges or court administrators in a lot of cases where it would truly benefit. But we now are on the cusp of being able to take the jury to a crime scene or to a catastrophe scene and have them actually replicate the view. Because what's critical here is that everything we do now, where we're presenting things on a monitor or a projection screen, we are basically telling the jury where to look. It's a fixed view. And for the first time with virtual reality, all the members of the jury can turn their heads and look around and make the decision for themselves what they want to see under what conditions. And of course, this will develop over time, but right now we see it being particularly important in cases, I mentioned the railroad collisions, where what you have is a very controlled scene. A locomotive has a known vector that it is traveling along because of the rails. And to the almost same extent, the road that crosses the railroad crossing at that point is fixed so that we know where these two objects were, the driver of the car and the driver of the train. And in so many of these railroad cases, what the whole case hinges upon is whether the locomotive engineer and or the driver could see each other. And visual obstructions in some of the areas in the Midwest where vegetation grows so quickly, it's a real problem. And it's relatively easy using Reconstruction forensics to determine what the speeds were, because the acceleration of the truck is a knowable or a determinable factor, and the motion of the train is recorded on an event recorder so that you can basically put together what occurred. So what we are now finding is that if you can give the jury a seat in the train and in the car, you now can accurately and under constrained conditions allow the jury to see for themselves about what you could see as the car is approaching the railroad track, as the jurors are looking left and right because they don't know which direction the train's coming from. And it's a great way for people to really find out how much visual warning a truck driver, in the case I mentioned, or the locomotive engineer, how much warning of this collision was available. And then, of course, you add the component of whether or not the train whistle was blown at the proper time. All of these factors in a railroad crossing collision are definable enough that we believe courts will be willing to allow juries to experience this because it's a controlled and demonstrably accurate recreation of a series of events. You can have the same thing in a crime scene. We do a lot of police shootings and working both for the police department and for the family of the decedent in many cases. And those cases always involve questions of what could be seen under various circumstances, and we think that virtual reality is going to be a good way to tell that story. And the drone allows us to get a three-dimensional crime scene efficiently and easily. And, of course, we also combine that with terrestrial laser scanners so that what we consider to be the optimum arsenal for a forensic team in the field right now is a simple drone and a laser scanner. And if you have those two devices, you can get the absolute high-resolution, provably accurate reconstruction of any crime or disaster scene.
I have some follow-up questions, but you mentioned there were two cases that you wanted to talk about. What was the other case?
That was a case we just handled at the end of last year, which was interesting in San Francisco. A property owner was in a warehouse that he owned, and it's an extraordinarily cluttered, if you can imagine King Tut's tomb multiplied by 1,000. That's why when I walked into this place, I felt it had everything from pinball machines to motorcycles and ping pong tables. I mean, it was just the biggest collection of treasures and junk that I've ever seen. And what made this so interesting was that the owner of the building was assaulted by an intruder, and part of what was critical to that case was allowing the jury to understand how isolated the location was, as well as to understand where the space where the assault occurred was in relation to the other tenants in the building and the people outside. And so what we did in that case, I went to the roof of the building and took a Phantom 4 drone, and I flew it and mapped the whole exterior of the building and the street intersection in downtown San Francisco. Then I went into the warehouse with a ferro laser scanner, and I scanned the entire interior. when I got back to the studio, I took the three-dimensional data from the drone, which was effectively the exterior of the building, and then combined it with the laser scan of the interior so that we were able then to allow the jury to fly down to the building and then dissolve away the wall and to show this incredible mountain of debris, junk, and objects, and to show where the events took place so that the jury had a spatial understanding of what took place and where everything was with regard to the building and with regard to the exterior. If we had tried to do this 15 years ago, we would have had to build everything by hand using either blueprints or photographs, and we would have had what at best would have been an approximation, because the amount of information that was required by the laser scanner inside this building, it was truly astonishing. So it's a great example of how combining those two new forensic tools, the drone and the laser scanner, allow us to really have the best of both worlds. You know, a really good macro view of the exterior of the building and the two streets, complete with all the signage and the traffic lights, and then going all the way down into the microscopic view of this incredible sort of tomb-like structure where the events took place. And so a lot of what's being done in these forensic cases is you try to give the jury two things. The first is understanding, and the second is persuasion, because we have to keep in mind in almost every case, whether it's a criminal case or a civil case, there are two sides with opposing viewpoints. You know, somebody's either seeking to hold someone liable, or somebody is, the state's trying to put somebody in jail. So you have basically two competing stories, and to be able to succeed, lawyers have to not only get the jury up to speed to understand what occurred, and then to persuade them as to what the version of the events are that they feel support their case. So those two factors, you know, education and persuasion, are really the cornerstone of forensic visualization, and why our company and others like us are now deemed essential in major cases where, you know, decisions are being made involving the freedom of someone or the amount of money being claimed for injury or death.
What sort of challenges are there in getting the reports or the final products introduced as evidence? I mean, part of the data is virtual, and there are software engineers, designers.
Yes.
Is all of that called into question from the opposing counsel?
Yeah, and it's and you know, that kind of is the way I ended up getting involved in this. I had one of my partners in the law firm where I was practicing at the time had hired an animation company from Denver, Colorado. And of course, this was really early in the days. And they were producing things that were interesting visually, but completely inadmissible per the laws of evidence and the jurisdictional requirements of the court. And so my law partner asked me, because of my background, I had taken a lot of graphics courses and was interested in film, graphics, etc. He said, "Hey, why don't you fly out there and see if you can straighten these guys out?" So I went to Denver for a couple of days. That was my absolute first exposure to forensic animation, you know, and I wish I could even remember who those guys were, because, boy, they were pioneers. But besides drinking a lot of beer, we had a hell of a good time. And when I got back, I was actually thinking, this is a field that I would really like to get into. And of course, things came to pass, and that's exactly what occurred. But one of the reasons that I saw value from my perspective was being trained and actually experienced in the law of evidence. And it puts a huge advantage to the preparation of an exhibit if you understand what is necessary for that exhibit to be introduced into evidence. It's not rocket science. It's a fairly basic and certainly understandable series of rules. But if you are not trained, it would be like, I work on medical cases, but I never kid myself that I'm going to ever have the level of information of a trained physician who has not only had the years of medical school, but also the experience in the surgical suite. So the best I can do is try to acquire that information with the help of experts who are, in fact, physicians. And so in this instance, we like to position ourselves as being able to provide the service from the eyes of an attorney, because we understand what's necessary and where the pitfalls are. It turns out, for instance, in that particular case that we just talked about, I had to take the witness stand, and the opposing attorney attempted to question the level of accuracy. And that's a problem if you don't understand beforehand, because the minute you are not able to confirm and endorse the level of accuracy that the court requires, all of that effort has now been excluded, and your client, the attorney, has the regrettable ignominy of seeing the jury told that his expert and his exhibit are not to be trusted and are kicked out. So it's there's a lot at stake. You've got a high dollar exhibit like you've built the entire island of Molokini, and if you can't establish to the court's satisfaction that what you've depicted is accurate and fair and not prejudicial, all of that effort goes down the tubes. And there's more than a few companies who are very skilled at producing animation or three-dimensional objects, but they don't understand the requirements of the law of the Code of Evidence. And so you raise a really good point, and that is, I think, one of the reasons that we are as successful as we are, because that's the first and foremost thing on all of our work, is that we consider to what extent we have to establish rules of admissibility.
In addition to using drones to walk through a crime scene, what other type of cases do you think drones can be useful?
Kind of a related point on that. We are right now in discussions with a police department up in Michigan that has a very respected accident reconstruction school that officers and departments from around the country come up to this academy where they actually train and teach techniques of forensic mapping and accident reconstruction. And they reached out to us. They had seen one of the presentations that I gave at a forensics convention, and they expressed interest in drones, and they absolutely 100% get it. If you look at what a typical state trooper or police officer does, the time, energy, effort, and expense of their career is heavily weighted towards traffic mishaps, and particularly serious ones. And that's understandable. And it also, given when I look at our workload, by far the majority of cases we work on involve some sort of mishap that took place involving ground transportation. And it turns out that every one of those cases, every single one of them, has what we call a TCR, a traffic and collision report. And it's a very standard and well-known document that is intended to give whoever needs that information an understanding of what occurred. And that means measuring where the resting positions of the vehicles were, taking statements of the witnesses at the scene, and basically putting together the package of what occurred. Because you may have 10,000 collisions in a given year in your jurisdiction, and maybe 1,000 of those will involve serious litigation or either civil or criminal. So you really don't know which ones are the ones that are going to really end up in court or require investigation by the city or another governmental agency. And so my point is that document, the TCR, is the foundation that everybody's lived with for decades. And it is completely limited and subject to a lot of error. Most of the measurements are taken with a roller wheel, and the roller wheel is really an inaccurate device if not employed correctly. If you get bounce on the roadway, or if you get the officer not really paying attention to where he's taking the measurements from, you end up with the whole basis of the scene is out of scale. And that's just one of the problems with it. So if you put a drone in the trunk of the car, and if you train an officer, as soon as he gets to the scene, and once you have secured the scene and any medical attention that's required for the victims, the very first thing he or she should do is put a drone up at 50 feet and shoot a series of shots. And that would completely revolutionize the TCR. And they don't even have to process it. You don't have to process this imagery until it becomes important. But if you had a drone in the trunk of the police car, and if you had just a smart device, a phone or a tablet that you could then fly a little mapping mission using Pix4D or Drone Deploy or even DJI's new ground station. There are, a whole bunch of available tools that will produce the images necessary to pull absolutely accurate information in terms of distance and in terms of physical evidence. So when I look at cases, every case that we have to replace what I just described to you. And often we're not involved in a case until a year or two or more after it's happened. And in many instances, the roadway's changed. They've either changed the striping on the freeway, or they've added a new lane, a new left turn lane, or added different lights. So we lose a lot of information just because of the lack of freshness. It still turns out to be extremely valuable for me or one of our team members to fly a drone and acquire that basic information of the accident site or the crime scene. And if we could only get this process to accelerate where police officers are trained and accepting of the notion of a simple, very limited drone mission, take about 15 minutes is all it would take, and we would have such an improvement of accuracy, and as a result, a benefit to the public in terms of how cases are decided. So much of what we end up spending in terms of litigation and expense is simply because there's not a definitive answer to what occurred at a given scene. And that's usually because the information available is ambiguous and subject to different interpretation. So the more that we can get information that is accurate and contemporaneous to an event, bingo. That's why I'm a big proponent of body cams for the police. And that's controversial, I understand, but I am a firm believer that information is always preferable to the lack of information.
The program in Michigan, are they going to pursue it?
Yeah, we've actually outlined 2 classes, and we're waiting to hear back from the department. We've already got the word that what they're trying to make a decision now is for the initial test of this, they want to limit the days. So one of our options was a 2-day class that we can teach a basic curriculum. And it's really right now just a question of whether they're going to opt for the 4-day, more robust curriculum, or the 2-day. And I think they'll go with the 2-day. They'll bring in 20 or 30 people and get feedback as to the value of the class and whether this is something that is successful. And that's going to be measured by what these people that attend the class are able to do unattended. And so the stakes are high, but I'm very comfortable, and we've certainly taught in a number of settings. And so I'm very comfortable that we can give a motivated attendee enough information that they can become functional and valuable. So I think we're talking about doing it in March. We'll see if they can make the decision in time. That's coming up pretty quick. That looks like where we're going.
I think that's exciting. As a city planner, I'm fascinated by how local governments might be able to use drone technology.
In that regard, I didn't realize you were a city planner, but there's a big firm out of Sacramento that is urban planning, and they've hired us a couple times to do these interesting pedestrian and vehicle traffic studies. And it turns out the drone is just so perfect for that because you can park it above an intersection. We had a kind of interesting job with 4 different teams with 4 different intersections, and we collected data that then the firm analyzed, and they're able then to track people, track traffic flow, pedestrian flow. Just a fantastic tool that I guess you could only do it if you had a hydraulic lift or something, and even then you're not going to get enough of the area that you could with the drone.
Given your experience with using drone technology in visual forensics, are there any sensors or hardware, software that you wish you had that hasn't been developed yet?
Infrared's a little bit problematical because the nature of the sensor necessarily limits you to the amount of resolution that you can get. And so you have to be kind of application sensitive. The current unit is, certainly good for detecting hotspots and doing some, search and rescue stuff. But for us in a forensics field, I would really like to see a larger sensor that can get us more levels of temperature, because that would be extremely useful in forensic cases. So that would probably be at the top of my list. The other one, what I would say, if I could wave a wand, you mentioned about the fleet of drones, and we have a huge number of drones, the largest ones which almost never fly, because the portability of a unit is so important to us. So we find that the biggest unit we've flown in the last year is a DJI Inspire. And the bigger units are all sitting and probably are going to either be sold or donated to the Stanford UAV Club. And so what that brings to mind is that we were surprised at how useful the little Mavic Pro is. And the camera is good enough that we have done, and we have been using it in some forensic mapping, and the ability to get that unit up in the air quickly, unnoticed, and, kind of a stealth mode is extremely important. So if I could choose, I would say, give me that level of portability with 4 times the resolution, because almost everything we do is optical based. And if we could get an X5 camera quality on a Mavic, we would be in tall cotton.
Well, who knows? Who knows who's listening that might help?
Well, yeah, my good friend Romeo Dersher at DJI has given me some hints that we're in for some big things here pretty quickly. So I noticed that they formally terminated effectively the Phantom line below the Phantom 4 Pro. I think the Phantom 3 Standard may still be technically sold, but as a practical matter, they have cleared the decks. So it's obvious we're about to see something, and the fact that I think we're going to see something in the level of portability with a higher camera quality. So I'm hoping that my wish is more than just wishful thinking.
What advice would you give to law firms that might be thinking about adding this type of service? What do they really need to be aware of?
When you talk about legal clients, one of the things that I'm sensitive to, one of the first things I would say is that you have to make certain that if you're going to fly this mission, whether you have somebody do it or whether you hire us or you hire someone else, you have to be sensitive to the FAA requirements. And the reason I say that is I've got a good friend who is in the same business I am, and he gave a deposition a while back before 107 was in place. And the truth was, he was not eligible and did not have his Section 333. And so in that particular case, being put in a situation where he was deposed, you now have the other side in a major lawsuit able to stand up in front of the jury and say, our opponents here flew this illegally. Now, that may not have any bearing on the quality of the information, because whether or not you have your remote pilot certificate doesn't affect the drone or it doesn't affect the information you get, but it sure as hell affects how you're perceived in the courtroom. And it's very possible, if a lawyer is smart, that they could actually get information excluded if they could prove that it was acquired in violation of federal law. So I would first tell lawyers and law firms, more than any other potential audience, that you got to be very careful that what the information was acquired by a firm or an individual who is properly licensed and able to fly, and who flew either with the required waivers or under a situation where it was not in a no-fly zone. But I think that this is something that people are going to get caught in the legal field in forensics, that we've got some stuff coming up for the state of California that we are going to be flying for Caltrans, the California Transportation Department. They're giving us, they're closing down a freeway. They're giving us all the support we need, but we're going to have to be very careful to make sure that we get the appropriate waiver, because we are definitely going to be too close to LAX to be able to do this unless we have a waiver. So that's something that I'm trying to get them to commit to a time for when we do this. I'll be real honest with you. It'd be real simple to go fly that without worrying about it. But that's where people are going to get into trouble. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that it isn't going to bite you down the road. And so in litigation and forensic cases, I really stress that people have to understand, because they will, very likely be cross-examined on how they flew, when they flew, and under what waivers or restrictions were applicable at the time.
Is there anything that we missed in regard to using drones in visual forensics?
Obviously, it's an ethnocentric view. When I look at what we do, it's very parochial in the sense that I see everything through the lens of the forensic cases we work on. But when I look at what drones are good at, I discovered that if you're a reasonably talented pilot, the altitude hold of a drone is really quite good now, to the point that it is now relatively easy to use the drone to replicate vehicle motion. And by that I mean, if we get to the scene of a collision, what we used to have to do, and we did all the time, we would mount a camera on the windshield of a car and then drive it through the scene and then use that footage to recreate what the driver saw. But what we are now doing, we measured the height of the driver's eye position, and we fly several passes with the drone replicating that position, and then we fly at progressively higher altitudes so that we can now digitally add the vehicle, and we can replicate not only the driver's view, but we can also replicate chase cam views and God's eye views, they call them, of collision scenes. And this is something that has really changed our life, because we used to do vehicle driver point of views all the time, and now the ability to just capture that footage from the drone has really made it a lot easier. And it turns out that if your flight path is accurate, it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of bringing that footage in and then adjusting the velocity in the studio in post. So that's kind of a little tip that anybody that's doing forensics, most people don't think about it, but in addition to obviously getting the 3D photogrammetry, but actually using the drone as a recreation of a witness view is extremely helpful. And just because you're used to flying at 100 feet doesn't mean that you can't get really good information at 4 feet. Or, we've done bicyclist views. We've hovered the drone at various witness points of view, including second-story window views. So the drone is really like a movable tripod in the sky. So that would be my tip is, stop thinking about it as a drone and start thinking of it as a camera.
And that gets back to the point that you made earlier, that the purpose of everything you do is to present to the jury the most realistic story of what happened in the case.
That is a good point to end on, which is the drone is really just your eye, and you are able to move your eyes effectively, almost anywhere now. And now that is just an amazing tool. You've suddenly acquired a superpower.
That's it for episode 88 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed listening to Mark Johnson of Visual Law Group and learning how drones are used in litigation. I want to thank Mark for taking the time to speak with me and sharing his expertise. If you want to learn more about Visual Law Group or want to connect with Mark, check out the webpage at visual-law.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a positive review on iTunes. It really does help. And as always, I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show,
this has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.